It was an ordinary Saturday, or so I thought. My day had been going as planned, with nothing out of the ordinary. I had just returned from a long week at work, looking forward to relaxing and spending time with my friends. But little did I know that what would unfold over the next few hours would completely alter my perception of the world around me. The morning had been calm, with nothing to indicate the chaos that was about to come. I spent some time cleaning my house, enjoying the peace and quiet. It wasn't until around noon that the phone call came in from Jake. Jake, the son of the Homeowners Association, HOA president, had always been the type of guy who had a way with people. He could talk his way out of anything, charm anyone into letting their guard down. And that day, he would do the same with me. He asked if he could borrow my Mustang for a quick spin around the neighborhood. Now, let me tell you, I was protective of that car. My Mustang wasn't just a vehicle. It was my pride and joy, a symbol of the years of hard work I had put into getting it. It wasn't the kind of car I'd just hand over to anyone, especially not to someone like Jake. But there was something about Jake. He was always smooth, always persuasive. His father, the HOA president, had a certain level of authority in our neighborhood, and it seemed that the whole community bent over backward to accommodate his every whim. Jake's confidence was almost contagious. He'd always flattered me, calling my Mustang the coolest car on the block. On that day, he was throwing in extra compliments, telling me how he'd always dreamed of driving it, how it would be a dream come true. Part of me wanted to say no, but part of me thought, what could go wrong? I told myself it'd be fine. After all, he promised he'd be back in an hour, and he assured me that nothing would happen to the car. He was practically begging me, saying he'd only drive it for a quick trip. And the next thing I knew, I was handing him the keys. As soon as Jake took off, I felt a sense of unease creep up on me, but I shrugged it off. I sat back down in my living room, trying to distract myself with some music and a movie. But the clock was ticking, and my thoughts began to race. I glanced at my phone. 1 hour had passed, and 2. At this point, my anxiety started to build. Jake should have been back by now. I tried calling him, but there was no answer. I kept telling myself that maybe he'd stopped for a snack or gotten caught in traffic, but with every passing minute, my worry grew. I paced around my house, glancing out the window every few minutes, waiting for any sign of my Mustang. But there was nothing. It felt like time was moving in slow motion, and then finally the phone rang. I almost jumped at the sound, relieved that it was Jake, expecting an apology or an excuse for being late. But when I answered, what I heard shook me to my core. "I'm so sorry. I crashed your car. It's bad. I don't know what happened." His voice was trembling. I could hear the panic, the confusion, and the undeniable sense of guilt in his words. I froze. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. "What do you mean, crashed? How bad is it?" My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to grasp what he was saying. "Where are you?" I demanded, trying to stay calm. I'm on the outskirts of town, near the old highway," Jake stammered. "I swear I didn't mean for this to happen. I lost control of the car. I don't even know. It's bad, man. It's really bad." His words were nothing more than a blur in my mind, but the one thing I was certain of was that my Mustang was no longer in one piece. The anger started to surge inside me, but the worry for my car overshadowed everything. I immediately grabbed my keys, telling him I was coming to get him and to stay there. As I drove towards the location Jake had given me, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't fathom what had happened. Jake was known for being reckless, but he was always lucky enough to avoid real consequences. But now he had crossed the line. The Mustang wasn't just a car to me, it was a piece of my history. It was my escape, my achievement. The thought of seeing it wrecked, destroyed, filled me with dread. When I arrived at the scene, I saw Jake standing next to my Mustang. My heart sank. The car was a wreck. The front end was smashed to pieces. The hood crumpled like paper. It wasn't just a little fender bender. It was catastrophic. I could barely recognize the car. It felt like everything I had worked for had just been torn apart. Jake, standing there, looked like a deer caught in headlights. He seemed genuinely scared, his face pale, hands shaking. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a deep sense of regret. But was it genuine, or was this just another one of his tactics to avoid taking responsibility? I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to lash out. But instead, I stood there in silence, processing the reality of the situation. What was I supposed to do now? My heart dropped to the pit of my stomach. The Mustang, my pride and joy, the car I'd worked so hard to afford, was in pieces. I couldn't even comprehend what I was hearing. The car, my beautiful, sleek Mustang, was no longer the shining machine I had spent years dreaming of. The sound of Jake's voice, trembling with guilt and panic, only added to the cold knot forming in my chest. It was surreal. How could this happen? I demanded to know where he was, and he told me that the crash happened on the outskirts of town, near an old, abandoned highway. I felt the blood rush to my head as my mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing. My first instinct was to grab the keys and go straight there. I rushed out of my house, my hands shaking, heart pounding with each passing second. It felt like a nightmare. The whole way there, I kept trying to prepare myself for what I might see, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastation that awaited. When I arrived, I couldn't even recognize the car at first. The sight of it, crumpled and battered, was beyond heartbreaking. It was as though my whole world had crashed along with the car. The front end was completely smashed beyond recognition. The bumper was hanging off, the hood twisted like a crumpled soda can. The fenders were bent out of shape, and the wheels were dislodged at awkward angles. The Mustang, once a symbol of my hard work and achievement, now lay in ruins. I could barely breathe. All I could think about was how Jake had taken my Mustang, my prized possession, without a second thought, and completely destroyed it. I witnessed the end of the world. His face was pale, his body stiff, and his hands were trembling. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, almost as if he was too afraid to face what he had done. But despite the fact that I wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation, I couldn't find the words. I was in shock. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that my Mustang was no more. My thoughts were scattered, my emotions running wild. It wasn't until I looked at Jake that I began to feel a growing sense of anger. His usual cocky demeanor was gone. Instead, he was standing there like a broken man, repeating, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." But the more he spoke, the less I believed him. His words didn't match the gravity of the situation. How could he stand there, acting like he was completely innocent when he had caused this destruction? He kept repeating that it wasn't his fault, that it was just an accident. The brakes failed, he said, over and over again. I lost control. At first, I wanted to believe him, but the more he said it, the more his story sounded rehearsed, like he had been coached on what to say. There was something off about his explanation. The brakes failing? That didn't add up. I knew my car. I had kept it in pristine condition. There was no way the brakes just failed out of the blue. I crossed my arms and looked at him, my patience wearing thin. I had to keep my cool. This wasn't just about a minor fender bender. This was an expensive, life-altering event. I couldn't let Jake get away with this so easily. His apologies weren't enough to undo the damage. I told him to stay put while I called the police. This was serious, and I wasn't going to let him get away without facing some sort of accountability. Within minutes, the officers arrived at the scene. They began asking questions, but Jake's answers were vague and lacking in any real detail. He seemed to have trouble remembering the specifics of the crash. I don't really remember, he kept saying. It happened too fast. His lack of clarity was frustrating, but I kept my composure. I couldn't let him slip through the cracks. The officers were polite but firm. They asked Jake to explain what happened, but every time they prodded deeper, his answers became more evasive. I don't know, he said. I just lost control. I couldn't do anything. It was clear to me now that Jake wasn't just a careless driver. He was using his family's influence to avoid taking full responsibility for the wreck. As the HOA president's son, he thought he could get away with anything. I could sense the privilege that came with his last name, the belief that he could simply walk away from this without consequences. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I could feel my anger rising, the injustice of it all eating at me. Jake had done something terrible, and now he was trying to brush it off with flimsy excuses. The more he spoke, the more his lies piled up. I couldn't let him manipulate the situation any longer. The officers were trying their best to get to the truth, but it was clear that Jake was stalling. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. I couldn't let him use his family's influence to escape the consequences of his actions. No matter how hard he tried to deny it, he was responsible for the destruction of my Mustang. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this without facing the repercussions of his reckless behavior. As the officers continued their questioning, I stood there, steeling myself for what was to come. This was just the beginning, and I wasn't backing down. The following weeks after the crash were a blur of emotions, legal threats, and tense negotiations. Jake's family, especially his father, the HOA president, made sure to stay in the picture. They quickly approached me with an offer, one that seemed almost too good to be true. They wanted to settle the matter privately, out of court, and avoid any legal battles. Their proposal was simple. They promised to pay for the repairs to my Mustang, but with one major catch. They wanted me to sign an agreement that would absolve Jake of all responsibility for the crash. At first, the idea of getting the situation resolved without involving lawyers or dragging it through a lengthy court process seemed appealing. The thought of receiving payment for the repairs and moving on with my life was tempting. But when I read the fine print, I realized how insidious their offer really was. By signing the agreement, I would not only be letting Jake off the hook, but I would also be giving up my right to hold him accountable for what he had done. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It was about justice. Jake's family had the power to control the situation, or at least they thought they did. They were used to getting their way in the neighborhood, leveraging their status to get out of tricky situations. But I wasn't like the others who might have cowered in the face of their influence. I had worked too hard for that car, for everything I had, and I wasn't going to let some spoiled kid, backed by his powerful father, get away with this. It wasn't just a matter of repairing my Mustang, it was about standing up for what was right. So I made the decision. I refused their offer. That's when the real battle began. The HOA president, a man who was used to intimidating people into compliance, started pulling strings. He tried to use his influence to pressure me into dropping the case. I started receiving phone calls from his associates, suggesting that I could save myself a lot of trouble by settling privately. They hinted that if I pursued legal action, it would be a drawn-out affair, one that could take years to resolve. The threats didn't stop there. The HOA president himself called me. His voice, usually calm and authoritative, was now laced with a sense of urgency. He told me that I didn't want to make an enemy of him or his family. He even suggested that my reputation in the community could suffer if I continued to push this. People won't forget if you make this public, he warned me, his words dripping with veiled threats. I could hear the unspoken message, don't challenge us or there will be consequences. But I wasn't scared. I had a principle, and that principle was justice. I had done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to back down just because Jake's father had a bit of clout. I knew I couldn't let them bully me into silence. So I did what I thought was right. I hired my own lawyer and took action. This wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the car either. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful their family, could escape the consequences of their actions. The legal process was intense. My lawyer and I met with Jake's family multiple times, and each negotiation was more heated than the last. Their lawyers came prepared with arguments, using every legal loophole they could find to try and avoid paying for the damages. But my lawyer and I stood firm. We knew the law was on our side. Every time they tried to dismiss their son's responsibility, we countered with evidence, pictures of the wreckage, witness statements, and a clear history of Jake's reckless behavior. They couldn't escape the facts. Finally, after several court hearings and tense negotiations, the case reached a resolution. The judge ruled in my favor. Jake's family was ordered to pay for the full cost of repairing the Mustang, and Jake was held accountable for his actions. It was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, I was relieved that justice had been served, but on the other, it felt like a long, exhausting journey. The whole ordeal had taken a toll on me, emotionally, mentally, and even physically. I had spent sleepless nights worrying about the case, wondering if I had made the right decision. But in the end, I had learned an invaluable lesson. Sometimes, standing your ground is the hardest thing to do, but it's the only way to ensure that justice prevails. And as for Jake and his family, they learned that no amount of power, influence, or money could shield them from facing the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about paying for the car. It was about holding them accountable for their reckless behavior. The story didn't end with my Mustang being repaired. It was a reminder to myself and to everyone else that standing up for yourself is essential. No matter how powerful someone's family is, no matter how untouchable they may seem, justice can still prevail if you're willing to fight for it. And next time, when someone asks to borrow my car, I'll trust my instincts a little more before handing over those keys.